All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Matthew Bianchini, and for this presentation, I thought long and hard about an interesting topic that would interest me enough and would also generate enough information for me to have a substantive presentation on. And the topic that I chose was a bizarre cult rock band that I'm pretty sure nobody in this class has heard of, which is precisely why I chose it. A rock band called Cardiacs, which is, I have labeled them the strangest, most influential band that you've never heard of. And even though that might sound hyperbolic, I think as we get into these slides, you'll see why I've labeled them as such. I mean, you can't tell by looking at the picture. This is a pretty bizarre band. So, yeah, we'll get right into it. So, there's a lot of text on this slide, which I'm not going to read through, but essentially why I chose to do this presentation was I thought that the Cardiacs would be a fascinating band for others to learn about, as much as they are fascinating for me to learn about, already a seasoned fan of their music. I think because there's a lot of mythology behind them, and there's plenty of apocryphal stories about them, and their whole oeuvre and aesthetic is just very bizarre, and it's somewhat of a legendary thing to be reckoned with in cult rock music. However, besides that, I wanted to also maybe this can act as a good horizon broadener for those of you who are attuned to more creative or unconventional music. Or if you're not, you could just learn about them and never listen to them. That's totally apt as well. But in short, Cardiacs, they were an English band. They most often got grouped in with the progressive rock movement. And they were founded by this guy, composer and songwriter Tim Smith in the late 1970s. And their music, often imbued hyperactive pop music and psychedelic music, which inspired many a reaction among their contemporaries and their peers, most likely leading to a lot of admiration and influence from fans of their music, as well as widespread, critical dislike and critical hatred among the more seasoned rock critics that were reluctantly giving them the time of day. So yeah, this movement that they're in progressive rock, I probably should have elucidated that a little more, but progressive rock is sort of a subgenre of rock which tends to place emphasis on flashy solos and technical proficiency and bizarre, complicated arrangements, which totally does go in with their musical universe. However, you'll find that their sound is so unique it's really hard to keep them contained into one movement. Alright, so now we're going to talk a bit about their musical lineage and their influence. The band released 8 studio albums in its lifetime, and they were Britain's purveyors of complex and often, very frenetic progressive rock music. And in addition to progressive rock, which is what they were normally labeled a lot of the time, their sound incorporated a myriad of other genres and aesthetics and traditions like heavy metal, Baroque music, punk rock, circuit music, nursery rhymes, and even a lot of piano counterpoint that almost sounds classical at times. So it's really this giant, wild blender of different disparate sounds that made them so unique and singular in what they are. And coupled with their complicated compositions and melodies, the band leader Tim's lyrics were often evasive and preoccupied with the mystical or the nonsensical. So, when they started out in the 70s, the Cardiacs were influenced by, plenty of, arty post-punk and new wave bands, like Frank Zappa, Devo, XTC, and Pink Floyd and Beatles and things like that. However, they kind of took all of the aesthetics and all of the tenets of these band sounds and put them in a blender, and then added their own maniacal electricity into the mix, and that's what really made them sound the way that they do. Now, I mentioned that Cardiacs were especially influential. Now, they've been influential on a lot of underground bands. Some of these bands you actually might have heard of, the Britpop band Blur, and the metal band Faith No More, and the metal band Tool, too. But there's also many artists that they've influenced that you probably have not heard of, Joanna Wang, which she's actually one of my favorites. She's a Taiwanese pop artist, the Britpop band Super Furry Animals, and the internet-based musician Neil Cicierega were all influenced by Cardiac's singular style of music. Now, if we're talking about what these artists all take from Cardiac's music, I thought a bit about this, and I kind of surmised that it comes down to four main points. So, in my view, the aforementioned artists all call from various hallmarks of the band's music, including many key changes and ever-changing tempos. Their tempos were not steady at all; they were very all over the place. They also had a very kind of offbeat and nerdy aesthetic too. Their lyrics were quite bizarre and mystical, and they had a fiery theatricality about them that lended itself to such genres like glam rock and prog rock. And speaking of the band's hallmarks, if we think about their lyrics, there are quite a few noticeable motifs in Tim Smith's songwriting. You have a lot of nonsensical parables and surrealist sort of lines. You have a lot of things about the loss of innocence and childhood whimsy, biblical imagery. Suburbia is a big thing for them, and So this is basically what their lyrics are all about, and they're as inscrutable and as bizarre to understand as ever, just like their music. So their lyrics and their music are intertwined in being quite difficult to understand a lot of the time. So the band as a live presence, even more so than their recorded music, they put on a very, very bizarre live show that drew a lot of people who were not even interested in their music but were looking for a strange spectacle to kind of gawk at. So even though their performances were more toned down and formal going into the 90s, in the 80s their bizarre live shows were a huge draw for crowds among Britain, and they were often singled out by the press as a spectacle like none other. The band donned turtlenecks and lift attendant uniforms as well as poorly applied clown makeup, perhaps as an effort to parody and directly oppose standard rock band posturing. In an act of performance art, band leader Tim Smith would often act hostile and belittling to the other band members, verbally abusing them to disarm and confuse the audience. And, in reviews, you can read old reviews of these shows, and it was just described as complete and utter pandemonium, which is a theme with this band, as you can see. I think somebody's at the door, by the way, if anybody wants to get. Okay. Now, I know that all this talk of their musical brilliance essentially means nothing if you guys have never heard of their music. Never heard their music, I'm sorry. So what I did was I did not want to infringe on any copyright laws, but I took one of their compositions and I actually transcribed it for the piano. And this is from their song Odd Even. There's a piano figure that comes in the back half that's really interesting and beautiful, and I hope the sound will play. But yeah, I transcribed, this is not composed by me, but I did transcribe it and play it. And this is the sheet music, so I can play a bit of that, tell you how some of their music actually sounds. That took quite a long time to figure out, you couldn't tell by listening to it. But there's a lot of there's notes that you wouldn't expect to be typically in the note sequence of a standard pop song like this. It's very naughty, it's very complicated, but it's brilliant all the same. This is around the time, this song is on their album, Sing to God, and unfortunately things were not going so well for the Cardiacs after Sing to God came out. Although Cardiacs inspired many bands, namely bands in the punk, metal, and art pop scenes, their critical reception was never really in their favor. Many critics were totally unsure of what to make of a band whose music was very abrasive and rash and bizarre, and not helping matters was the band's public personas, which were deliberately off-putting and almost impossible to take seriously. And many of their releases flew under the radar when they were released, and they only got critically venerated and critically acclaimed as later years went on, which is the case with a lot of bands, a lot of cult bands like this. Like their album Sing to God, that last song was on, is often called their masterpiece. But I think when it was released, it got a 0 out of 10 in Vox magazine. So that kind of goes to show you the disparity between their fans' enjoyment of their music and what the mainstream media thought of them, which, was essentially zilch. It got a 0 out of 10. So it was not going great for them. After they released their magnum opus, Sing to God, they released their final studio album, which was called Guns, which was more concise and kind of straightforward than their past music. And they began work on a new studio album whose title was LSD, though the album, the recording of it proved to be long-winded and rife with difficulty, and they were still hard at work on it 5 years later. And this is where the story gets kind of sad. Production was postponed when the band leader, Tim Smith, he had suffered a series of strokes and a heart attack in June of 2008. And this heart attack, it led into a series of strokes, and he was left unable to perform or speak. He was paralyzed for the rest of his life. But in October of 2018, which is something I think is long overdue, with Smith in attendance, he received an honorary doctorate in music from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. And 2 years later, in July, he passed away peacefully at his home. And many influenced by Cardiacs expressed their admiration and love for the band in the face of his passing. So I've just done all these slides talking about this band, but I kind of want to elucidate what they mean to me and the importance that they hold. As a musician myself, who has an ear, always turned toward unconventional music, they influenced me to experiment compositionally and try to think outside the box when putting together my own music. And there's something very beautiful in the irreverence and mischief and the fun of their songs that there's a lot of real seriousness and beauty underneath the artifice of them being this totally crazy, wacky band. And so beneath their bizarre presentation was something close to hinting at the meaning of life. I still don't know what that is, but having music such as theirs as a guidepost places the question just that much nearer in my grasp. Alright, thank you.